Meanwhile, Shanti awoke with her body still weary. She glanced around the room and smiled as memories of her and Vasper's intimate moments flooded her mind. The jealousy she had felt towards Samara melted away, replaced by the warmth of those memories. Vasper was no longer beside her, she was now wrapped in a blanket. Glancing down at her body, she realized she was still naked. The clock on the wall showed it was already past 11 in the morning. She jumped out of bed in a panic. Was it already noon? She hadn't even noticed when she fell asleep in the early hours of the morning. Rushing to the shower, she quickly washed and changed into a red two-piece bikini, the strings tied seductively at the sides of her hips, accentuating the curves of her waist, the elegance of her stomach, and the subtle grace of her belly button. The top tied at the back revealed a tantalizing amount of cleavage, highlighting the beautiful shape of her bust. She then layered a mini knitted dress over the bikini, the large holes in the fabric barely concealing the enticing outfit underneath. Smiling, she admired herself in the mirror, pleased with the way the dress highlighted her body. The dress was just long enough to cover her bikini area, and the transformation in her appearance since Samara's arrival made her more self-conscious, especially with Vasper around. Despite Vasper's countless reassurances, her jealousy towards Samara refused to fade. Last night, thanks to her newly acquired heightened hearing ability, Shanti had overheard Vasper's whispers in the air while she was in the shower. It was enough to make her believe whatever Vasper told her, but she had no intention of revealing her new ability, not even to David. It was an advantage she preferred to keep to herself. As she listened closely, she could hear Vasper busying himself in the kitchen. How would she face him after their argument and the passionate moment that followed? She stepped out of the room and made her way to the kitchen, where she saw Vasper cooking. He noticed her immediately, Vasper's eyes fixated on her, his gaze following her every movement as she fetched water from the dispenser. When she turned around, Vasper was right beside her, startling her slightly. "Good morning," he said, gazing deeply into her eyes with a sweet smile, his arms wrapping around her waist in a tight embrace. "It's almost noon," she replied with a playful smile, but before she could say more, Vasper kissed her passionately on the lips. He held her tightly, and Shanti let out a soft, deep moan that only fueled Vasper's desire. She wrapped her arms around his neck as he lifted her and placed her on the island table. "I love you so much, Shanti," he whispered in a low, husky voice, their lips locked in an endless kiss. Shanti was the first to break away when she noticed Jake standing at the kitchen entrance. "Jake," Shanti whispered urgently to Vasper, her eyes locking with Jake's, unaware of his presence until that moment. Vasper quickly turned to see Jake standing there, his hair tied back in a ponytail, a bow and arrow slung over his back, dressed entirely in black with a long jacket and leather boots. Jake's expression was cold as Vasper lifted Shanti down from the table. "Oh, you're here again," Vasper said irritably. "What do you want this time, Jake? You're always interrupting." Jake let out a bitter laugh, while Shanti felt uncomfortable under Jake's gaze, which traveled from her head to toes, further irritating Vasper. "Watch where you're looking, Jake," Vasper said sternly, his voice tense. Jake, seemingly embarrassed, turned away abruptly and headed toward the living room. As soon as Jake left, Vasper hugged Shanti again, and they teleported back to the bedroom. "Change," Vasper ordered. Shanti quickly removed her dress to change, but as soon as she was undressed, Vasper embraced her again, and they shared another quick kiss. With a smile, Vasper finally let her go. She pulled out a jogger set from the cabinet, Vasper's eyes following her every move, mesmerized. Shanti tied her hair back into a ponytail and turned to face Vasper, who was smiling at her. "Beautiful," he said softly before they teleported back to the kitchen. Vasper resumed cooking while Shanti watched him intently. "How do you know how to do such simple tasks? I know, you have plenty of servants at home," she said softly and playfully. Vasper glanced at her and smiled warmly. "When my mother was alive, this was our bonding time in the kitchen. She taught me how to cook. My mother was an excellent cook. Even though we had plenty of servants, she always made sure to prepare my meals herself whenever she was home." Shanti was touched by Vasper's story, finding it amusing that they shared similar experiences. Her own mother had also been a great influence, teaching her how to bake. Smiling, she watched Vasper, admiring his smile so much that she was drawn to him once more, kissing him lightly. Jake is in the living room. I should go check on him, Shanta said. Vasper, though reluctant, had no choice but to let her go as Shanta made her way to the living room. What would you like to drink, Jake? Juice or coffee? Shanti asked as she found Jake standing at the entrance, facing the beach. Jake turned to look at her, their eyes locking again. Nothing, he replied coldly. Ah, okay, Shanti responded, feeling uneasy in Jake's presence. His gaze made her feel as though he could see right through her. She turned to head back to the kitchen. Wine. Do you have any red wine? Jake asked, making her turn back to face him. Okay. I'll get some for you, she replied with a smile. She walked back to the kitchen, aware that Jake's eyes were following her. Upon returning to the kitchen, Vasper's expression was serious as he looked at Shanti. Although Jake was an unwanted guest, they still had to treat him with some level of hospitality, even if it bothered Vasper. Shanti found a bottle of Don Lorenzo's red wine in the refrigerator, and she smiled at Vasper. Is there any other red wine here? She asked, noticing Vasper's intense gaze. That's the only one available, Vasper replied. Shanti grabbed the bottle and a wine glass, carrying them to the living room. When she arrived, Jake was sitting on the sofa, his legs spread, elbows resting on his knees, and his hands clasped. His eyes were on Shanti. I'm sorry, Jake, but this is the only wine we have available. It's local, from my vineyards. Shanti said, placing the wine bottle and glass on the center table, avoiding Jake's gaze. She realized she had forgotten the wine opener and was about to return to get it, but Jake took the bottle and opened it effortlessly with his bare hands, his eyes never leaving Shanti. She smiled briefly and was about to leave when Jake called her back. Shanti, won't you stay with me for a while? It's quiet here in the living room, Jake said, his tone warmer than any she had heard from him before. But before Shanti could respond, Vasper was suddenly beside her. Their eyes met, and Shanti could sense the tension between them. Jake smiled, looking at Vasper. I'm your guest, aren't I? Shouldn't I be treated with proper hospitality? Jake said, pouring himself some wine. An unwelcome guest, Vasper muttered under his breath, his gaze never leaving Jake's. Shanti grabbed Vasper's hand, squeezing it gently. Let's finish what we were doing in the kitchen, she urged, pulling Vasper away. But Vasper was still seething as he watched Jake drink the wine, the relaxed smile on Jake's face contrasting with Vasper's tense demeanor. Why are you here again, Jake? Vasper asked, his tone serious. I'm here to take Shanti away from you, Vasper, Jake replied blatantly, his gaze unwavering as he looked at Vasper, taking another sip of wine. Vasper's body tensed with anger at Jake's words. Shanta squeezed Vasper's hand again, holding his gaze. Jake noticed their clasped hands and stared at Shanti with a look she couldn't quite place, puzzled by the sudden change in his demeanor. Jake, we'll be leaving soon. You don't need to come for me, Shanta said, her tone equally serious. But Jake's eyes stayed fixed on Shanti before returning to Vasper. Let's go back to the kitchen, Shanti urged Vasper, pulling him away. Once in the kitchen, she embraced Vasper and kissed him deeply, knowing he was jealous of Jake. Vasper responded with even more passion, holding her tightly as their kiss deepened. It was a long time before they finally broke apart. I love you, Vasper, Shanti whispered. I love you more, Shanti, Vasper replied, their words overheard by Jake, who sat quietly in the living room, sipping his wine. Jake forced a bitter smile as he stared into his glass, accepting the pain that came with seeing Shanti, knowing that this was the path he had chosen, even if it hurt him. Shanti prepared a meal for Jake, knowing that while she had no feelings for him, Vasper couldn't help but feel uneasy seeing her near Jake. Shanti arranged the food tray before Jake, and when she was about to head to the kitchen, Jake called her. Shanti. Jake's voice pierced, commanding her attention. Shanti turned around, her eyes immediately locking onto his. The room seemed to shrink around them as they stared at each other, a silence heavy with unspoken words and lingering emotions. Time itself seemed to stretch, each second a weight pressing on Jake's chest. He could feel his heart pounding, but still, he delayed, savoring the rare moment when her gaze was fixed solely on him. Shanti waited, expecting something, anything, from Jake. But when he finally spoke, his voice was soft, almost hesitant. "Where is your drinking water?" The question was so mundane, so utterly ordinary, that it took Shanti a moment to process it. She blinked, the tension breaking as a faint smile touched her lips. "Ah, okay, sorry, I forgot," she replied, a bit flustered. She turned back toward the kitchen, her steps hurried. Vasper, who had been watching her every move with hawk-like precision, noticed the deliberate timing of Jake's request. He knew all too well that Jake's request was a ploy to keep Shanti in the living room longer. With a sudden, protective impulse, Vasper moved closer, intercepting her before she could grab the water bottle. "I'll take it," Vasper said, his voice firm as he took the bottle from her hands. Without another word, he strode into the living room, placing the water on the table in front of Jake. Their eyes met, Vasper's gaze sharp and unyielding, Jake's brimming with silent challenge. Jake smiled, but there was no warmth in it, only a cold, mocking edge. "Thanks," Jake said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Wasn't Shanta the one getting it? Why did you bring it?" Vasper held Jake's gaze, his jaw clenched in silent defiance, then turned away without a word. The tension between the two men was palpable, thickening the air like a storm about to break. Shanti, oblivious to the silent war between them, busied herself with the food Vasper had prepared. She sat at the small kitchen table with Vasper, the space intimate, just enough for the two of them. She took a bite of the dish, her eyes widening in delight. "Your cooking is so delicious," she said, savoring each bite as if it were a precious gift. "I wouldn't get tired of eating this every day." Vasper's heart swelled with joy at her words. "Really? I'm happy you liked it. Don't worry, I'll cook this for you all the time." Shanta looked up at him, her eyes sparkling with genuine affection. "What's your favorite dish? I want to learn how to cook it for you." Vasper's heart skipped a beat. "Me? Anything you cook will become my favorite," he replied with a chuckle, making Shanta laugh with pure, unfiltered joy. They shared a moment of laughter, the sound filling the small kitchen, lightening the air. Jake sat in the living room, his ears catching every word. The joy that filled the kitchen did not reach him. Instead, it twisted inside him, a bitter jealousy gnawing at his heart. The food he had just eaten, which had tasted so good moments before, now turned to ash in his mouth. He pushed away his plate, unable to swallow another bite. Rising from his seat, he picked up his food tray and headed back to the kitchen, his steps heavy with a weight only he could feel. When he entered, his eyes fell on Shanti and Vasper. They were locked in a passionate kiss, their bodies pressed close as if the rest of the world had ceased to exist. The sight hit Jake like a blow to the chest, the familiar pain stabbing at his heart. He was used to it by now, that cold, aching jealousy that tore through him every time he saw them together, but it never hurt any less. Vasper's eyes catching sight of Jake in the doorway. He broke the kiss, his gaze hardening as it landed on Jake. A silent accusation passed between them, unspoken but clear as day. Jake's presence was an intrusion, a constant reminder that he was always there, watching, waiting. Vasper's voice was cold, laced with irritation. "You always have the worst timing, don't you, Jake? Always interrupting." His smile was tight, forced, and devoid of humor. Jake ignored him, his expression unreadable as he handed the tray to Shanti. She took it quickly, her movements flustered as she tried to diffuse the tension. "Jake, are you done eating?" Shanti asked, her voice soft as she took the tray from his hands. "I'm full," Jake replied, his eyes lingering on Shanti for a moment too long. "Thank you." He turned back towards the living room, but not before Vasper's gaze followed him, a silent warning in his eyes. Vasper didn't like the way Jake acted, the way he looked at Shanti with those piercing eyes that seemed to see too much. After they finished eating, Shanti and Vasper cleaned up the kitchen, their movements synchronized in a familiar dance of domesticity. When they finally stepped outside, they found Jake sitting on the balcony, staring out at the ocean. The sunlight was harsh, casting sharp shadows across his face, but the turquoise water was inviting, shimmering with a promise of cool relief. Jake's voice was cold, devoid of any warmth. Shanti, it's time to head back to David's mansion. He's waiting for you there. There's something important you need to discuss. Your family lawyer, Marie, will be there too. Shanti exchanged a glance with Vasper, her heart sinking at the thought of leaving. The day was beautiful, the water calling to her with an irresistible pull. She wasn't ready to go back just yet. Can you go ahead, Jake? I want to take a quick swim in the sea first. Vasper can bring me back after, Shanti said, her voice laced with hope. Jake's expression didn't change. He remained silent, his eyes fixed on the ocean as if he hadn't heard her. Shanti took his silence as consent, a small smile playing on her lips as she grabbed Vasper's hand, pulling him towards the water. They laughed as they ran, the sand warm beneath their feet, the waves crashing gently at the shore. Shanti quickly stripped off her clothes, revealing the bikini she had been wearing underneath. She looked at Vasper, a playful glint in her eyes. "Cover me," she whispered. Vasper shielded her with his body as she removed her jogger set, tossing it onto the sand. Now dressed only in her bikini, she felt the thrill of freedom as Vasper scooped her up, carrying her into the water. They both laughed, the sound echoing across the beach, full of joy and freedom. But as soon as they hit the cool water, Shanti's laughter faded. A memory surfaced, unbidden and unwelcome, a memory of Vasper and Samara, the way they had been together on Samara's 17th birthday, playing in the water just like this. Her smile faltered, her mind clouded with doubt. Vasper noticed immediately, his brow furrowing in concern. "What's wrong?" he asked, brushing a strand of wet hair from her face, his touch gentle, loving. Shanti forced a smile, shaking her head. "Nothing, just a memory, that's all," she said softly, though her voice carried a weight that didn't go unnoticed by Vasper. He pulled her close, wrapping her in his arms, his lips brushing against hers in a tender kiss. Despite the warmth of the sun, the water was cool against their skin, refreshing and invigorating. They stood there, the waves lapping gently around them, lost in the moment. "I love you," Vasper whispered against her ear, his voice thick with emotion. Shanti sighed, leaning into his embrace, her hands covering his as they rested on her body. "I love you too," she murmured, though the words felt heavier than they should have, burdened by the memories that lingered just beneath. Vasper kissed her neck, his hands roaming across her skin, but Shanti's thoughts were elsewhere, drifting back to that painful memory. She couldn't shake the image of Vasper and Samara, wondering if they had shared the same tender moments she now had with him. They stayed in the water, their bodies entwined, but Shanti's mind was 1,000 miles away, lost in a sea of doubts and fears. And somewhere on the shore, Jake watched them, his heart heavy with an ache he could never quite shake, his eyes filled with a longing he could never express. Jealousy surged within Shanti once again, though she knew she shouldn't be jealous about Samara. After all, she hadn't even met Vasper at the time. But the thought gnawed at her, driving her to pull away from Vasper's embrace. She turned to face him, her eyes searching his. "Is this what you did with Samara in that video? On her birthday?" Shanti asked, her voice trembling. Vasper was left speechless, his mouth parted. "Shanti, why are you bringing that up?" "That was so long ago, before we even met," Vasper replied softly, his voice gentle, trying to soothe her doubts. "Is that what you were thinking about earlier? Is that why you suddenly went quiet?" Vasper asked. Shanti nodded, still staring into his eyes. "But don't you think we should let go of that? It will only cause you more pain to dwell on the past." "Don't let the past hurt you, Shanti," Vasper said, his tone full of compassion. "You're always jealous of Samara, but you have no reason to be. Shanti, my heart and my body belong only to you. My relationship with her ended a long time ago, even though I never officially ended it. I didn't expect her to come here, since she was living in another country." Shanti forced a smile, but it was strained. Vasper glanced toward the house, noticing Jake watching them, eavesdropping on their conversation. Vasper's expression darkened, his protective instincts flaring. "At David's mansion, I overheard them talking about me and Samara. They said that Samara is like your legal wife and that I'm just the other woman because you kept me hidden while Samara was known publicly." Shanta's voice was laced with bitterness. Vasper winced, hearing the pain in her words. Who said that? I'll break their neck, Vasper growled, anger flaring in his eyes as he glared at Jake, who was still watching them. It doesn't matter. They were just joking, but it hurt because it felt true. What if someone else sees us? Will I be the bad one, the woman who stole you from Samara? Shanta's voice quivered, on the verge of tears. Vasper could feel the shift in her emotions, the weight of her insecurities. Shanti, you're the one in my heart. You're the one I love, not Samara. You're the only one who has my body. My past with those women is over, Shanti. That was a time of madness, but now my life is different. My world revolves around you. Please, stop bringing up Samara. I have no feelings for her. She's just like all the other women who were in my past, gone. Shanti, her voice trembling with emotion, asked, how long are we going to keep hiding our relationship? Until Alexander Mondragon is out of the picture, Vasper replied without hesitation. When will I be ready to face him and end all of this? When will I be free from David's control? Shanta's voice was firm, demanding an answer. Vasper was stunned by her sudden determination. When you're strong enough to face him. It depends on your ability, he replied, his voice filled with concern. Shanti took a step back, distancing herself from Vasper. The sadness in his eyes was visible, and she could see that her decision hurt him deeply. Then from now on, I want to start practicing, so I can be ready to face Alexander Mondragon. And can we also stop any physical touch between us? Until the public knows you and Samara are no longer together. Shanta's voice was serious, unwavering. Vasper laughed, caught off guard by her request. What do you mean, no physical touch? That's not possible, Shanti, Vasper protested, a hint of desperation in his voice. Shanti smiled at his reaction. Why not? It's a new rule. No physical touch until the public knows you and Samara are separated. No kissing, no holding hands, nothing, Shanti declared, her tone playful but resolute. Vasper looked up at the sky, laughing in disbelief. Shanti bit her lip, looking at Vasper laughed, showing his Adam's apple. He is seductively attractive. She restrained herself from strong urge to kiss him. Shanti, I can't. I can't stand just watching you. My God. I'll go crazy, I swear, Vasper exclaimed. If your love is true, prove it, Vasper. This is the only way I won't be constantly haunted by Samara's shadow. She'll come back, I know it. So, this is our new setup, okay? Shanti proposed, a determined look in her eyes. They were now standing farther apart, and Jake, still on the balcony, smiled, having overheard their conversation. Vasper scowled at Jake, then turned back to Shanti, who was resolute in her decision, knowing that clarity would come if they followed through with it. Vasper sighed, chuckling as he looked at Shanti. You love torturing me, he whispered. No, it's not torture, Vasper. It's just an agreement. Besides, I'm only yours. There's no one else, just you. Shanti said in a sultry voice that sent shivers down Vasper's spine. I love you so much, that's why I want everyone to know publicly that I'm your girlfriend, not Samara. And I'll focus on my skills so that I'll be ready to face Alexander. Is that okay? Shanti stepped into the shallow water, her body glistening, the water highlighting every curve, every line of her figure. Vasper's desire grew as he watched her, his eyes tracing her every movement. Shanti, aware of the effect she was having on him, enjoyed the moment, smiling to herself. But she wasn't the only one torturing Vasper. Jake, standing on the balcony, struggled with his own emotions, torn between looking away and the pull of Shanti's allure. When do we start? Vasper asked, his voice thick with desire. Now, she bluntly said. How about tomorrow? Vasper suggested, almost pleading. Shanti laughed, her joy pure and unfiltered. She had no idea how much she was seducing Vasper with every word, every glance. But before she knew it, Vasper was in front of her, pulling her close, kissing her deeply. his arms wrapped around her tightly. I love you so much, Shanti. I can't do this. I can't stand it. Vasper whispered against her lips. Shanti responded to his kiss, but quickly pushed him away gently. This is the only way I won't be jealous of Samara, Vasper, Shanti said seriously. Vasper looked into her eyes, his own filled with intensity. Their eyes locked, silently talking. Vasper's eyes roamed over her. All right. Deal. Vasper agreed, though every fiber of his being resisted. Okay then, let's go, Shanti said, stepping out of the water, her body like that of a goddess emerging from the sea. Her curves, her bust, her waist, her hips, and legs were all perfectly sculpted. Her long hair, soft and curly, added to her ethereal beauty, like a divine being, half human, half angel. Her smooth skin gleamed under the blazing sun, every step she took was mesmerizing. Vasper's eyes were glued to her, following her every move as she walked toward the house where Jake stood on the balcony, watching her intently. Vasper seethed with anger, glaring at Jake, but Shanti noticed Jake's eyes fixed on her. She smiled, knowing she had gotten back at Vasper, just a little, for the jealousy she felt toward Samara. As Shanti approached Jake, his gaze never left her. Vasper, unable to contain his anger, walked up to Jake. What are you staring at, Jake? Vasper asked sarcastically, his tone laced with contempt. Shanti headed to her room, took a shower, and changed her clothes. She washed her bikini and Vasper's clothes, hanging them out to dry behind the house. They cleaned up the mess in the house, even washing the mattress they had used, hanging it out to dry as well. Meanwhile, Jake waited for them on the balcony, his mind racing with thoughts. When everything was finally in order, Shanti and Vasper were ready to head back to David's mansion. As Shanti returned to David's mansion, Vasper teleported her to her room. The new setup unsettled her. Vasper stood, staring at her, waiting. Thank you for agreeing to my request, she began. To make things easier, could you avoid teleporting directly into the room? You might find me in a compromising situation, like in the shower, or, well, you might see me undressed, she added hesitant. Shanti's voice faltered as she spoke, uncertain how Vasper would react to her request. Vasper's expression soured, his gaze intense. What? I can't even look at you? So where am I supposed to wait for you? In David's living room? Vasper's brows furrowed, clearly displeased with Shanti's new boundaries. Shanti, we shouldn't complicate our lives just because of Samara. She's nothing to me now, we're not together. You're the one I want, the one I love, Vasper said, his voice desperate. But Vasper, Shanti replied, technically, she's still your girlfriend. You never officially ended things with her. She's coming back soon, and she won't accept your decision easily. I've ended our relationship, Shanti. She just can't accept it. She can't accept that it's over between us. But isn't that her problem now? As far as I'm concerned, it's done. Why do we have to suffer for it? Vasper's voice was desperate, pleading for Shanti to understand. But the problem, Vasper, is that your relationship went public. You were just seen kissing on her birthday party and at the airport. Everyone knows about it now, she said, her words heavy with the weight of the truth. She tried to steady her voice, holding back the tears that threatened to fall. I'm just giving us space, so you can resolve things with Samara. How will I face her when she returns? How will I interact with her at the vineyard? You have no idea how hard this is for me, Shanti said, tears streaming down her face. Vasper panicked, seeing her cry. I'm sorry. Please, don't cry, he pleaded. He wanted to approach her, but their new rules prevented him. I need you to officially end things with her publicly. She keeps kissing you, because she thinks you're still together. It hurts me to see that, to see you two having any kind of skin contact. It breaks my heart. Her voice trembling. Let's start over, Vasper. Shanti whispered. They argued for a long time, Vasper's face filled with sorrow. I love you, Shanti. This new setup is torture, Vasper's voice was soft, devoid of its usual strength. I love you too, Vasper. This is hard for me too. Every time I see you, I want to come closer, to kiss you, to hold you. But we need to keep our distance until we make things right, she replied, her voice thick with emotion. I just want to make things right. Anyway, you can go back to the island now. David and Marie are waiting in the living room, Shanti added, her voice resolute. Vasper, his shoulders slumped and eyes downcast, responded, I'll come back tomorrow. Okay? He asked. Okay, Shanti whispered back. I love you, Vasper. I love you more, Shanti, Vasper replied, their eyes locking as they fought the urge to close the distance between them. Then, Vasper vanished from her sight. Shanti changed into something casual, preparing for a discussion with her lawyer about the vineyards. The sheer volume of paperwork made her head ache, even with David and his lawyer assisting her. The legal discussions involved Samara's involvement in their vineyard partnership, along with new projects like a winery and a processing plant for grape products, and the hiring of new employees, among other matters. In just a week, Samara would return for further discussions, but Shanti had no intention of attending. She decided to let David handle everything. She would sign only where necessary. She also wanted to avoid facing Samara, Laika, and Prince Raphael. She hoped Raphael wouldn't be there. By 8 p.m., Marie, David's lawyer, and their secretaries had left. David had arranged a sumptuous dinner for their legal teams that evening, and Shanti thanked David for his assistance and everything he had done for her. After they left, Shanti stepped outside to the garden to clear her mind. She drank some tea to help her relax and fall asleep. She was grateful that her father had trained her in the vineyards when he was still alive. Yet, her thoughts kept drifting back to Vasper. She felt sorry for how he had reacted to the new boundaries she had set between them. Even though it was difficult for her too, she knew it was necessary. Every time she saw Vasper, she longed to be in his arms, to kiss him, to feel his warmth. But she needed to clear her conscience, and she couldn't stop thinking about Samara. She understood Samara's feelings and knew that their relationship had started on the wrong foot. But she was now at a point where she had no other choice. She couldn't bear to be apart from Vasper, even though their relationship had started by trampling on Samara's rights. Shanti couldn't face Samara without feeling guilty. Her jealousy towards Samara wouldn't disappear until Vasper made things right with her. She decided to keep herself busy with her skills. Besides the vineyards, she had other businesses that her father had left in her care. Closing her eyes, she leaned back on the bench and sighed deeply. She remembered that she had two important tasks left to do, building a new mansion for herself, as she and Vasper had once planned, and finding a place for her father's ashes. Instead of leaving them with David, she decided to place them in the vineyard, so Don Lorenzo could finally rest in peace. She always carried her father's jar with her, never letting it out of her sight, no matter where she went. Shanti felt a sudden chill, an unfamiliar presence lurking close by. Every hair on her body stood on end. Instinctively, she rose to her feet just as the doorbell rang at the gate. She hesitated, watching closely. Moments later, Samuel appeared, heading towards the gate. The scene struck a chord in her memory. She had seen this before, but where? As Samuel neared the gate, panic surged through her. Samuel! Shanti shouted, her voice breaking the tension. Don't open it. Step back. Samuel turned to her, confused, as she frantically gestured for him to move away from the gate. Reluctantly, he obeyed, retreating from the threshold. The doorbell continued to ring, its insistent chime unnerving. David emerged from the house, eyes narrowing in confusion at Shanti's alarm. David, she urgently explained, there are 4 men and 2 women outside, they're elves, and they're enemies. David's expression turned grim as the seriousness of her words set in. But how did Shanti know? Louis, Marco, Justin, Gabriel, and Jacob quickly appeared, assessing the situation. Jake, however, teleported directly to the gate, surveying the scene from the outside. The 7 guardians waited for Jake's signal, their movements tense and coordinated. Suddenly, an explosion rocked the compound. The gate, along with part of the wall, was obliterated. Jake was thrown back against the house but swiftly regained his footing. The battle erupted with a ferocity beyond the speed of ordinary sight, the 7 guardians clashing with the 6 attackers dressed in black suits. Shanti caught sight of 2 women with long, white hair, elves in their true form, moving too fast to track. The elves were relentless, trying to reach Shanti, but the guardians fought fiercely to keep them at bay. The chaos enveloped Shanti, her fear freezing her in place. Glass shattered all around as the windows and walls of David's mansion crumbled under the onslaught. Amidst the destruction, Shanti felt paralyzed, unable to move. Then, a voice echoed in her mind, "I'm hungry." The words resonated through her, unmistakably from the Sword of Destiny. Shanti looked down at her hand, trembling as the sword materialized, electric blue currents crackling along its length. The energy surged up her arm, flooding her body with a searing pain. She screamed, the agony overwhelming her senses. The guardians and their enemies alike paused momentarily, eyes widening at the spectacle before them. The attackers, emboldened, redoubled their efforts to reach Shanti. Lewis used his telekinesis to lift the 6 figures into the air, straining to control them all. But as Shanti's pain peaked, she vanished from her spot, reappearing midair, and with a single, swift motion, she sliced through the 6 elves. She landed gracefully, the Sword of Destiny grounded at her feet. The guardians stared in shock as the 6 bodies fell lifeless to the ground, each bearing a fatal wound to the chest. The sword absorbed every drop of blood, leaving no trace. As Shanti stood, her eyes blazed bright blue, her beauty transformed into something otherworldly. Her hair floated around her, moving with a will of its own, as if alive. Shanti gazed down at the sword, a serene smile curling her lips as she gently caressed the blade with her delicate fingers. The 7 guardians encircled her, wary of her every move. Shanti looked up at them, her smile unwavering, but there was something different in her gaze, a chilling unfamiliarity. The guardians felt a cold dread creeping into their hearts. Jake and Jacob, in particular, were gripped by an uneasy fear. Jacob stepped forward cautiously, but as he neared Shanti, the tip of the sword was suddenly at his throat. The other guardians froze, every muscle tensed. Shanti's smile widened into a dangerous grin as she locked eyes with Jacob. Despite the fear tightening his chest, Jacob felt a strange exhilaration. Her gaze was fixed solely on him. A thin line of blood trickled from his neck where the sword pressed, only to be absorbed by the blade. David, watching from a distance, felt his heart drop. "Shanti, Jacob is not your enemy," he said, his voice trembling with concern. Shanti didn't respond, her eyes still locked on Jacob's, who remained still, captivated by her presence. Then, Vasper appeared behind Jacob, shocked by what he saw. He could hardly recognize Shanti in her transformed state. The tension in the air grew thicker with Vasper's arrival. Shanti's eyes shifted to Vasper, her smile turning fierce. Without warning, she attacked, her sword slashing towards him with lethal intent. Vasper barely managed to dodge, teleporting away just in time. But Shanti pursued him relentlessly, each strike faster than the last. The others watched in horror as the battle escalated, until Vasper teleported away again, this time reappearing directly behind her. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her into a tight embrace, and teleported them both into her room. Vasper quickly stepped back as Shanti looked down at her hand, noticing the sword had disappeared. The blue fire in her eyes faded, returning to their normal golden brown. She blinked, disoriented, as she recognized Vasper standing before her, a relieved smile on his face. "You're back," Vasper exclaimed, stepping forward as if to hug her, but then he hesitated, remembering their agreement. "Vasper," Shanti cried out, panic lacing her voice. "Vasper, I'm so sorry. I couldn't control myself. It felt like I was dreaming. Did all of that really happen?" Her voice shook with fear. "It's okay," Vasper reassured her gently, trying to convey that everything was all right and that he understood. Shanti rushed out of the room, only to find the living room in ruins. David and the others stood outside, watching her cautiously. They knew she had returned to normal. Vasper joined her, surveying the damage. The destruction was severe, but thankfully, the nearest neighbors were far enough away that the commotion would likely go unnoticed until morning. The 6 elves lay lifeless on the ground, their pale skin almost ghostly white, their ears pointed, their teeth sharp. David and Vasper exchanged grim looks. They were sent by Alexander Mondragon, Vasper, David said gravely, his eyes narrowing. This is just the beginning of their manhunt for Shanti. Vasper clenched his jaw, fists tightening as Shanta looked on, worried. The 6 guardians surrounded the fallen elves, their expressions tense. Gabriel turned to Shanti, curiosity and concern in his eyes. How did you know there were 4 men and 2 women, Shanti? Wasn't that what you warned me about yesterday? Shanti nodded, her voice quiet but firm. The sword of destiny showed me. It was a vision of what was to come. The guardians were astonished by Shanti's newfound ability to foresee events. Shanti approached Jacob, guilt etched on her face. Jacob, I'm so sorry. I couldn't control myself. It felt like a dream. She glanced at the wound on his neck where the sword had cut deep enough to draw blood, though most of it had been absorbed by the blade. Jacob smiled weakly, understanding. It's okay, Shanti. I understand. But Shanti couldn't shake her guilt. She reached out, gently touching Jacob's wound, her eyes filled with remorse. Sorry, Jacob, she whispered, her voice trembling. But Jacob was entranced by her, his eyes drawn to her lips, his gaze softening. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the world around them faded. Vasper's eyes narrowed as he watched the interaction, his expression hardening. Jake, too, looked on with a sharp gaze, tension simmering beneath the surface. The other guardians exchanged glances, sensing the unease. Justin glanced at Vasper, reading his reaction to the situation between Jacob and Shanti. Gabriel and Lewis were also keeping a close eye on Vasper. David, however, observed Jacob and Shanti with a casual look, knowing Shanti's concern for Jacob was purely genuine. Realizing what was happening, Shanti quickly stepped back, the weight of her actions sinking in. I'm sorry. I'll do my best to control myself next time, so none of you get hurt, she promised, her voice quivering with emotion. She looked at Vasper, noticing the intensity in his eyes. She approached him, her voice filled with regret. Vasper, I'm so sorry. I'm just glad you managed to avoid getting hurt. If you had been wounded by the sword, I could never forgive myself. Her voice was filled with guilt, her eyes pleading for forgiveness. Vasper couldn't hold back any longer. He pulled Shanti close, their lips meeting in a passionate kiss. In that moment, they forgot their agreement, lost in each other. The 7 guardians averted their eyes, giving them a moment of privacy. Jacob had already withdrawn, choosing not to witness the intimate exchange between Vasper and Shanti. Meanwhile, Jake let out a bitter laugh, noting how the two had blatantly disregarded their agreement of no physical contact. Their bodies and lips seemed magnetically drawn to each other, inseparable. Overwhelmed by a surge of jealousy, Jake turned away, unable to bear the sight any longer. As Vasper and Shanti continued their embrace, whispering I love you to each other, the world around them seemed to fade away. Shanti, I can't stand not being able to hold you and kiss you, Vasper murmured against her lips. His embrace tightened around her, and Shanti's only response was a soft, deep moan that intensified Vasper's desire. For now, let's forget about that agreement. I need to make up for my mistake. This is my way of saying sorry to you, Shanti whispered between kisses. Oh. Is that so? Well, then maybe I won't forgive you just yet. Come here, Vasper said with a teasing grin before teleporting them back to the island beach, landing on the bed. They both tumbled onto it, laughing. Vasper, I just got back, and now I'm here again? Back so soon? Shanti said, giggling. Enough talk. Kisses and hugs should be enough payment for my recent transgression, Shanti laughed, still wrapped in Vasper's embrace. She glanced at the clock, it was just after 10 p.m. No, I think your debt is still pretty big, so the payment should be just as large, Vasper replied with a mischievous smile, sinking his teeth lightly into Shanti's neck, making her shiver with pleasure as they both laughed. After 7 hours, Vasper returned Shanti to David's mansion, and it was almost 5 a.m. They stood in the rec living room, but as soon as they arrived, they felt the tension in the air. The 7 guardians were positioned around a ruined space. David, his face clearly troubled, simply watched them as they entered. Shanti approached him, who was seated on the sofa, her expression full of concern. "David, I'm so sorry about what happened to your house," Shanta said, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. She was worried and felt deeply sorry for David. This was the second time his house had been destroyed. David looked at her and smiled gently. "That's not what worries me, Shanti. Rebuilding this house is easy. What concerns me is that their houses are also affected," David said, his gaze shifting to the 6 guardians standing around them. "Their homes were also destroyed by Alexander Mondragon's men," he added, his eyes landing on Vasper. Vasper was shocked by this revelation. "They're desperate to get to you, Shanti. And there's more bad news." The vineyard manager called. 5 hectares on the other side of the vineyard have been burned. They don't know what caused the fire, but everything has turned to ash over 5 hectares, David explained, deepening Shanta's shock. "And David, were any workers harmed in the fire?" Shanti asked anxiously. "Thankfully, no one was hurt," David replied. Vasper's eyes flared with anger, his jaw clenched, and his fists tightened. He had a suspect in mind, Laika. She must have retaliated for their confrontation at her mansion. "Laika," Vasper growled through gritted teeth, his voice low but clearly audible to everyone. Shanti turned to Vasper, her face and voice filled with concern. "Why, Vasper? What about Laika?" she asked. "After I left the airport, I went straight to her. We fought. In my anger, I smashed her TV right in front of her. She held back, not wanting her house to be destroyed," Vasper explained, prompting a few of the guardians to chuckle. "And she retaliated by burning over 5 hectares of the vineyard," Marco added. David shook his head as he looked at Vasper. "The vineyard burning is clearly Laika's doing, given how completely it turned to ash. But the attacks on the houses, those were definitely Alexander Mondragon's men. The crime prints left behind are identical," David concluded. "For now, Shanti, you'll have to stay at Jake's mansion temporarily," he suggested. But Vasper's expression darkened, clearly displeased with David's decision. "I'll bring Lorena back to accompany you there, along with Justin and Marco," David continued. "David, why Jake's mansion?" Vasper asked, his voice hard and irritated. Jake bristled at Vasper's tone. "Why, Vasper? What's wrong with my house? No one else has been there except us and Shanti. My house is safe for her. The elves only targeted my house in the north, but not my island mansion," Jake shot back, equally irritated. Vasper smirked sarcastically. "My island has crystals. They can't enter there. Shanti will be safe," he insisted. He approached Shanti, but from that moment on, there was no physical contact between them. David observed Vasper closely. "And are you okay with the 6 guardians staying there to protect Shanti? Not to mention Lorena?" David asked, his gaze serious as he studied Vasper's reaction. "Your island house is too small, Vasper. It'll be too cramped. Jake's house has more space, no problem," David added. "You can stay there too, right, Jake?" David asked, but Jake didn't answer and just turned away. Justin laughed. "Jake, bro, don't be like that. Shanta's boyfriend should be welcome there, right?" Marco teased, causing everyone who heard to shake their heads, especially Jacob. Shanta felt like she was caught between 2 clashing forces. Vasper continued to glare at Jake. "All right, David, I'll go back to Jake's mansion," Shanta decided, looking seriously at Vasper. "You can visit me there," she added. Even though Vasper didn't like Shanta's decision, he reluctantly agreed. Jake, however, was pleased with her choice but disliked the idea of Vasper visiting. "But we need to visit the vineyards tomorrow, David. I want to check on them," Shanti insisted. "Yes, but we can't stay long. The enemies likely know about the vineyard by now," David replied. "How much longer do I have to keep hiding from Alexander Mondragon, David?" And how long will all of you keep following me? Shanti asked with a bitter laugh, silencing the guardians and Vasper. Until you're ready to face him, David said seriously, his gaze fixed on Shanti, clearly conveying his message. We can only prolong the fight, Shanti. We can defeat Alexander's men, but not him. You're the one who can end this. When you're ready, we'll stand with you when you face him, David said, without sugarcoating anything. Shanti froze at David's words. She knew she wasn't ready. She still couldn't control the sword, and even Jacob and Jake had been caught in her attacks. She remained silent, turning back to Vasper. You can go home. I need to sleep, Shanti said, even though it was already morning, nearly 6 a.m. Since she and Vasper hadn't slept that night, Vasper hardly let her sleep, and whenever she'd doze off, he'd wake her again, leading her to ecstasy repeatedly. Vasper seemed insatiable, and she simply followed his lead, before they started their agreement of no physical touch. Vasper nodded slowly. But the guardians just watched, silently observing their interaction. Did Vasper not let you sleep last night, Shanti? Wow, Justin asked bluntly, causing the other guardians to laugh, except for David, Jacob, and Jake. Jake turned away after hearing Justin. Jacob also turned and walked away. Shanti, feeling embarrassed by Justin's question, quickly walked to her room without looking back. Vasper wasn't sure whether to laugh or be angry. David shot Justin a stern look. That wasn't a funny question, Justin, David said as he headed to his room. The remaining people in the room exchanged glances, and Vasper disappeared, teleporting to Laika's mansion. As Vasper entered Laika's mansion, the servants quickly scattered, leaving only Shalik behind. Where's Laika? Vasper asked angrily. His eyes roaming around the house, Shalik signaled that her mistress wasn't there, and Vasper immediately vanished from Shalik's sight. Shalik let out a deep breath of relief at Vasper's disappearance. While Vasper returned to his own mansion, he headed straight to his room. The room was so large that the sound of his footsteps echoed as he walked. He took out a formal suit, changed into it, adjusted the necktie around his neck, grabbed an attaché case, and opened the large vault. He took out several bundles of money and placed them in the attaché case. He locked the vault back up with swift, polished movements. He teleported to his car, started it, and drove out through the large gate. He traveled along the highway with only one goal in mind, to reach the high-rise building of a media station network. He wanted to personally handle the conversation with the television network about him and Samara. With the bundles of money beside him on the front passenger seat, he parked the car in a parking space, and everyone who saw him looked at him with admiration and respect. The women all had the same reaction, they were swooning over his handsomeness and elegance. His presence outshone even the celebrities in the building. He walked straight ahead, but some familiar faces recognized him instantly. Vasper overheard people talking about him. Isn't that Princess Samara's incredibly handsome boyfriend? Wow, he looks even better in person. My God. I've never seen anyone as handsome as him before. Is he even real? Some of the gossipers exclaimed. Wow, he's like a devil on earth here to tempt women, someone joked, followed by loud laughter. Oh my God. Even just 1 hour with him would be a dream. His good looks are to die for. If he became an actor, he'd surely be famous, others added. Vasper felt overwhelmed by the different voices discussing him, but they all had one thing in common, they were praising his physical appearance. He was extraordinarily attractive, impossibly handsome, taller than most, and commanded respect with every movement. He continued until he reached the elevator, heading straight to the top floor where the executive director was. In the elevator, he was joined by a beautiful and sexy celebrity, who was visibly shocked upon seeing him. After a moment, it became obvious that she was trying to catch his attention and flirt with him. Hi, aren't you Vasper Mondragon? Princess Samara's boyfriend? She asked. But Vasper didn't respond. The woman seemed disappointed by his silence. He kept his eyes fixed on the elevator door, ignoring her completely. It took some time before he reached the top floor, and the woman couldn't stop staring at him from head to toe. It was clear that she was interested in him, but he didn't show the slightest bit of interest in return. When he arrived at the top floor, the secretary of the executive director greeted him, and after a few minutes of discussion, the negotiations were completed. Vasper had brought payment that tripled whatever Laika had paid the network. The director smiled broadly. But Vasper issued a warning that if their agreement wasn't followed, the director should hide because he would find him no matter where he went. Vasper insisted that his wishes be fulfilled without compromise. The director was visibly shaken, clearly afraid, but still accepted the money and assured Vasper that they would clear the relationship between Samara and Vasper. The executive director showed great respect in Vasper's presence, knowing how influential Vasper was, especially in the business world. Even the building they were using belonged to him. The executive director was grateful that Vasper Mondragon had personally come to speak with him. In the past, it had always been Vasper's sister who dealt with him, but now he was face to face with Vasper Mondragon himself. The conversation lasted over an hour before Vasper finally left the office. He returned to the elevator, heading down the building. In the elevator, Vasper was joined by some male and female celebrities. The men felt insecure seeing Vasper, while the women couldn't hide their excitement and admiration. Vasper seemed to have a magnetic effect on them, their eyes never leaving him. Vasper overheard someone whisper to their companion, "Isn't he Princess Samara's super handsome boyfriend? They're perfect together. Samara's so beautiful, and he's beyond handsome." Vasper felt annoyed hearing these comments, but there was nothing he could do since that's how they saw him on TV. The celebrities in the elevator suddenly seemed ordinary in Vasper's presence, but no one dared to speak up in front of him out of respect. When the elevator doors opened, Vasper walked straight to his car, with everyone's eyes following him until he was out of sight. Meanwhile, despite being drowsy, Shanti forced herself to stay awake because she and David had to visit the vineyards. She took a cold shower, which awakened her senses and refreshed her. Her thoughts lingered on the vineyard that had burned down. If it was true that Laika was responsible, she knew she would never forgive her if any workers had been harmed. Shanti wasn't sure how much longer she could ignore Laika's actions, using her power to harm others. Laika was Vasper's sister, but Shanti didn't know how much patience she could muster before running out of it. Shanti went straight to the vanity mirror, grabbed the hairdryer, and started blowing her hair. She noticed it had grown longer, thicker, and healthier. Ever since the Sword of Destiny had come into her possession, the changes in her body had become more prominent. Even she admired her reflection in the mirror. She wore black underwear, but hadn't yet put on a bra. As she tied her hair into a ponytail, Vasper suddenly appeared behind her, startling her so much that she dropped the comb and let out a soft gasp, still trying to focus on tying her hair. Vasper laughed as he picked up the comb and handed it to her. But his eyes betrayed a strong desire to touch her. He bit his lower lip while smiling at Shanti, and the intensity of his urge made him break into a sweat, something Shanti noticed. In her mind, Shanti relished Vasper's reaction, understanding the powerful effect she had on him. Vasper loosened his tie and took off his jacket, leaving just his white long-sleeved shirt. Shanti stepped away from him, noticing the dazed look in his eyes, clearly intoxicated by her presence. But he held back, sticking to their agreement of no physical contact until he and Samara was clear to the public and officially over. "Weren't you supposed to wait in the living room?" Shanti asked quietly, covering her exposed breasts with her hands. Vasper, mesmerized, just stared at her. Shanti, too, felt a strong urge to embrace Vasper, especially seeing him struggle to restrain his desire to touch her. The sight of him removing his jacket, his body inviting and warm, made it even harder for her to resist. But she had to stay strong. She was the one who set the rules, and she couldn't show weakness now. Vasper smiled, but his eyes were playful and mischievous as they traced every curve of Shanti's body. "Of course. I didn't agree to that, but we did agree on no physical contact, though. It's okay, right? Besides, I didn't want to stay in David's living room with Jake there," Vasper replied. Shanti understood his excuse. Vasper sat on the bench at the foot of the bed, holding his jacket, his eyes never leaving Shanti as she put on her bra. She turned her back to him, not wanting to add to his struggle. She saw the longing in his eyes and the frustration on his face as he gazed at her. Shanti put on a white long-sleeved shirt that hugged her curves and tucked it into her leather pants, planning to go horseback riding around the vineyard. Vasper watched her intently, without blinking, as she pulled on her leather boots and finished tying her hair into a ponytail. He smiled as he watched her. "What a gorgeous, beautiful woman!" Vasper exclaimed, his admiration clear in his eyes as he looked at Shanti. She pretended not to hear him, but deep down, she was pleased by the compliment from Vasper himself. They left the room together, where 7 guardians were waiting for them. Vasper's rivals, Jacob and Jake, were already in their cars, while Samuel was standing by the wrecked gate. David had left instructions with Samuel that someone would come to clean up the wrecked gate and David's wrecked living room. When Shanta stepped outside, Jake stopped his car in front of her. "Get in," he said, but Vasper quickly intervened. "We'll ride with David, Jake," Vasper said firmly. Jake didn't argue and sped off, looking angry. Justin shook his head as he watched Jake drive away. Jacob, Gabriel, Louis, Marco, and Justin followed, with David bringing up the rear. Shanta sat in the back while Vasper took the front seat. They drove for hours, and during the ride, Shanti and Vasper exchanged glances in the mirror. David, who was driving, remained silent, fully aware of the agreement between Shanti and Vasper, something Jake had informed him about. David hoped Shanta's approach would be effective in clarifying her relationship with Vasper. When they arrived at the vineyards, they saw a large crowd gathered, curious about the recent fire. They parked in the designated area, and even from the car, Shanti could see the vast area of the vineyard that had been burned, over 5 hectares. Their faces were serious as they stepped out of their vehicles, especially Shanti, who was heartbroken to see the extensive damage. Vasper, too, was filled with mixed emotions as he looked at the charred land. He knew the fire had been caused by Laika's anger towards him, and she had taken it out on Shanta's vineyard. Vasper's face showed his fury as he stared at the destruction. But the crowd was more intrigued by the newcomers, particularly Vasper and Shanti. They recognized Vasper from Samara's party and from newspapers and TV. They couldn't stop whispering about how handsome Vasper was, and Shanti couldn't help but feel a pang of jealousy. Hearing people say that Vasper was Samara's boyfriend felt like a knife twisting in her chest. All she could do was listen to the chatter of the crowd. Vasper, too, felt conflicted, embarrassed in front of David, and angry at the people for constantly talking about him and Samara. He wanted to be close to Shanti, but it wasn't possible. The distance between them was painful for Vasper, knowing Shanti was hurting from what she overheard, especially since the crowd spoke so loudly and openly. Then, someone remarked, "Look at Miss Shanti. She's stunning. She's our pride in this town. She'd be perfect for Prince Raphael, wouldn't she? He's so handsome too. The prince is lucky to have Miss Shanti," one of them said with a touch of excitement. Vasper's jealousy surged, almost unbearable, as he struggled to contain himself. He felt restless where he stood, while Justin and the others laughed from afar, hearing the comments around them. David pretended not to hear anything, while Jacob and Jake were visibly angry at the mention of Shanti and Raphael. But Shanti acted as if she hadn't heard anything either, though she couldn't help but smile inwardly at the absurdity of her and Vasper's situation. They sat down on the veranda, waiting for the manager and the other workers. When the manager arrived, along with some of the workers, a lengthy discussion ensued about the fire. The city mayor even arrived, and they talked with Shanti, explaining that the fire had been caused naturally, struck by lightning, and many witnesses had seen the lightning hit the area, causing the large fire. The discussion went on for a while, but Shanti requested Arnold to bring out Rhonda. She then walked to the stables. When Shanti saw Rhonda, the horse recognized her immediately, and Shanti grinned widely as she approached Rhonda. "Did you miss me, Rhonda?" Shanti asked. "Let's go for a ride, okay?" she added, thanking Arnold for taking good care of her horse, to which Arnold smiled. Shanti also noticed Don Lorenzo's horse, Bruno. She looked at Jake. "Do you think you can handle Bruno, Jake?" she asked, her voice challenging. Vasper just observed, feeling a pang of jealousy that Shanti hadn't invited him, but he understood that she was trying to avoid suspicion. Jake approached Bruno, the black horse that belonged to Don Lorenzo. Shanti watched, waiting for Jake's next move. Arnold chuckled, knowing how difficult Bruno could be, as the horse was known to be temperamental and only recognized Don Lorenzo. The horse neighed loudly as Jake got closer, refusing to be touched. Everyone laughed as they watched Jake struggle with the challenge. Shanti and Rhonda also watched, laughing along with the others. For a moment, they were all amused by the challenge, but Jake eventually gave up, and Jacob stepped in next. Despite managing to mount the horse, Jacob was quickly thrown off when Bruno jerked his body violently. Everyone burst into laughter, especially Shanti. Her eyes met Vasper's as they laughed, and for a brief moment, they shared an intense look, their attraction to each other growing stronger. Shanti quickly looked away, focusing back on Jacob, who was dusting off his pants after being thrown. Justin tried next, but it was clear he couldn't even touch Bruno. The horse simply didn't like him, and Arnold couldn't help but laugh. "Anyone else?" Arnold asked, glancing at Vasper. The room fell silent, especially Shanti. She looked at Vasper, who smiled back at her. "Yes, you, Vasper, give Bruno a try," Shanti said with a mischievous smile, her eyes gleaming with the same playfulness. Vasper, feeling challenged, looked back at Shanti. He rolled up the sleeves of his long-sleeved shirt to his elbows, causing Shanti's heart to skip a beat as she watched him move, trying hard to control herself. Vasper approached Bruno slowly, raising his right hand while calling out to the horse. Everyone held their breath, especially Shanti, who was watching him closely. Vasper gently touched Bruno's head, and Shanti noticed that Vasper's movements were calm and reassuring. She couldn't help but smile as she watched Vasper build trust with the horse. "You are truly amazing," she whispered under her breath. Finally, Vasper mounted Bruno, and to everyone's surprise, the horse didn't resist. Instead, Bruno calmly accepted Vasper, impressing everyone, especially Shanti, who couldn't help but admire Vasper's skill. Arnold released Bruno, while Jake and Jacob both watched Vasper with a hint of envy. It seemed as if Bruno belonged to Vasper, the way the horse was so well behaved. Shanti was amazed, her eyes glued to Vasper. Their gazes met, and both smiled, equally astonished by how easily Vasper had tamed the horse. Suddenly, Shanti spurred Rhonda into a gallop toward the area where the fire had occurred. The others watched, amused by Shanti's sudden burst of speed. Vasper, unable to contain his laughter, watched as Shanti rode off. Then, without warning, he urged Bruno into a gallop, chasing after her. The onlookers were left speechless, their jaws dropping as the two horses raced away from where they stood. Vasper couldn't stop laughing as he watched Shanti ride. It was clear she was a masterful rider, every movement of the horse was perfectly matched by her body, as if she and Rhonda were one. Her hair streamed behind her like a banner in the wind, making the sight even more breathtaking. As Shanti glanced back at Vasper and Bruno, laughing when she saw how skilled a rider he was, something she hadn't known until now. It was a coincidence that they both wore white long-sleeved shirts and black pants, and also their horses black and white, making them look like a perfectly matched pair. Vasper looked even more attractive than usual, and Shanti felt her love for him deepen. He looked powerful on the horse, like a king or perhaps a knight in shining armor. "Remember your boundaries, Shanti. Don't forget," she reminded herself, trying to keep her emotions in check. As they approached the area where the fire had happened, Shanti slowed Rhonda, and Vasper did the same. When they reached the burned area, Shanti was stunned by what she saw. Everything was completely reduced to ashes. She looked at Vasper, who was surveying the surroundings, his mouth set in a tight line, anger evident on his face. Their eyes met, and Vasper spoke, his voice filled with regret. "There's no doubt Laika did this," he said, guilt heavy in his tone, knowing it was his argument with Laika that had driven her to take revenge on Shanti like this. "I'm sorry, Shanti. I didn't expect Laika to retaliate like this after our fight." Shanti looked at Vasper with compassion. "This isn't your fault, Vasper. Laika did this deliberately, she knew exactly what she was doing. I can't promise you how long I'll be patient with her, even though she's your sister. I may not be able to tolerate her for much longer," Shanti said directly to Vasper. Vasper felt a surge of happiness hearing Shanti's resolve. He wanted her to stand up to Laika, to fight back, because he wouldn't side with his sister, not even for a moment. "This vineyard isn't just for me, Vasper. Many people depend on it, it's their livelihood, what supports their families. So many will be affected if anything happens to this vineyard, Shanta said, her voice full of sympathy for the workers. When Shanti brought Rhonda to a halt, Rhonda stopped immediately and let out a single, relaxed whinny. Bruno did the same, coming to a stop and relaxing. Shanta dismounted her horse, and Vasper did the same, both of them now standing in the midst of the destruction. The distance from them made David and the others seem tiny, like ants beneath the vast sky. Shanti knew they were being watched from the building, though she was certain they couldn't be seen clearly. Still, a telescope was always on the veranda, ready for anyone wanting to observe the surroundings. That's why Shanti was careful not to get too close to Vasper. Vasper, if Laika tries something like this again, I won't be able to forgive her, Shanta said, looking directly at Vasper. He smiled at her. Shanti, not even a little will I side with her. I know all the wrong she's done to you. I want you to stand up to her, not just endure it. That's why she keeps pushing her limits, Vasper said. The people I'm defending here in the vineyard, I don't want their livelihoods to be affected. It's not just about what happens here at the vineyard, Vasper, Shanta said. Vasper felt a deep sense of pity for her, wanting to embrace and kiss her, but knowing there were eyes on them. Shanti walked over to Rhonda and stroked its mane. Rhonda, we're going to move you to the chateau, okay? She said, as if the horse understood her. Vasper smiled, watching Shanti and Rhonda. Shanti turned to Vasper and smiled sweetly at him, intoxicating him once more with her smile. My God, I want to kiss you right now, Vasper said bluntly, causing Shanti to laugh. Vasper's feelings for her only grew stronger. What if I break the rules, he teased, looking at her with a mischievous glint in his eye. Shanti glanced back at him. I haven't thought of a punishment for that yet, she replied. Vasper grinned mischievously. Watch out later when we get home, he warned, making Shanta's heart swell with joy. Vasper, you need to follow our rules until the end, Shanta said, though deep down, she would be delighted if he broke them. She mounted her horse again after spending a few more minutes surveying the area. She felt a deep sense of loss. Seeing the destruction around them, this would be a significant setback for their production. Vasper mounted Bruno as well. Can we head back early? Vasper asked. Together, they returned to the stables with their horses, side by side. When Vasper and Shanti returned to Building 1, the 7 guardians and the manager Joaquin were waiting for them on the veranda for lunch, which had been prepared in their honor. The city mayor had already left, along with the unexpected visitors who had come to the vineyard, drawn by the news of the fire that had broken out right after Princess Samara's birthday party at the same venue. The lunch went smoothly and casually, with David being an excellent host, engaging the guests in conversations about the vineyard. Shanta's father had made the right decision in trusting David with their business. However, Shanta still preferred to take full control of everything herself in the future, once she was ready, so that she wouldn't have to rely on the 7 male guardians to constantly watch over her. She longed for complete freedom for herself and Vasper. She glanced at Vasper, who was seated at a separate table, far from where she and David were sitting. Their eyes met across the distance, and for a brief moment, they exchanged a look filled with undeniable attraction and deep emotions. But the moment was fleeting, too dangerous to linger on, lest anyone notice the connection between them. Shanti quickly averted her gaze, only to find herself locking eyes with Jacob, who had been quietly watching her the entire time. She gave him a small smile before turning her attention back to the charred remains of the vineyard. Just then, a voice called out to her. Shanti! It was a woman's voice, causing everyone on the veranda to turn and look. Shanti turned and saw Jasmine, her close friend, standing at the bottom of the veranda stairs, grinning up at her. Shanta stood up abruptly, a wide smile spreading across her face as she looked at Jasmine. She waved her over excitedly. Come up here, Jasmine, she called, her body practically bouncing with joy. Jasmine was like a sister to her, the daughter of her nanny, Maria. Jasmine quickly ran up the stairs to the veranda. As soon as Jasmine reached the top, the 2 women embraced tightly, laughing as they did. Their reunion was filled with warmth and affection, as if they were the only 2 people in the world. Jasmine was focused entirely on Shanti, and Shanti was equally focused on Jasmine. Where have you been? I thought you had returned to another country, Shanti asked, still holding Jasmine's hands. Jasmine, her radiant smile never fading, replied, "Not yet, but maybe this month. I'm planning to take my 2 sisters with me to finish their studies abroad. I came with a purpose, to see you." "I'm sorry for what happened to your vineyard," Jasmine said, her voice and eyes full of sympathy. She squeezed Shanti's hand gently. "It's okay, Jasmine. We're handling things here now, that's why we're here," Shanti replied softly, grateful for Jasmine's presence. She was happy to see her childhood friend. "I've been coming back and forth here trying to catch you, but I never managed to. And then suddenly, I see you in the newspapers, on TV, and you're engaged?" Jasmine's eyes widened in surprise as she lifted Shanti's hand to inspect the ring. "Oh my! Is this for real?" she exclaimed, her eyes sparkling with surprise. "My God, your daddy is filthy rich, Shanti," she added with a playful laugh. Shanti blushed at Jasmine's reaction and instinctively glanced at Vasper, who was watching them with amusement. Their eyes meet, a bright expression on his face. And a mischievous smile. The 7 guardians were also paying attention. Only then did Shanti realize that they were not alone. Jasmine noticed too, suddenly falling silent. She hadn't even noticed the others before, too focused on Shanti. Jasmine's laughter faltered as she held Shanti's hand. Shanti squeezed her hand reassuringly. "Let me introduce you to everyone, okay?" Shanti said. But Jasmine's eyes were already wandering over the others, until they settled on Jake, who seemed familiar to her. There was something mysterious about Jake that she couldn't quite place. "Jasmine, these are my guardians, like brothers to me," Shanti explained. Jasmine nodded, smiling as she glanced at each of them. "This is David, Justin, and Marco," Shanti said, gesturing towards them. Marco's eyes lingered on Jasmine, clearly captivated by her beauty. Jasmine offered them a simple hi in greeting. "Louis, Gabriel, and then there's Jacob and Jake. I believe you've met them before, the last time we were in the other building?" Shanti added. "Yes," Jasmine confirmed, still gazing at Jake. He looked back at her, his expression cold and distant. Jasmine thought to herself, he's quite aloof. The others, however, smiled warmly. "And him?" Jasmine asked, pointing at Vasper. He looked at Shanti seriously, waiting for her response. There was a brief pause before Shanti spoke, her voice faltering slightly. "He's one of the investors, brother, here at the vineyard, and a friend of ours." Her heart ached, as she couldn't introduce Vasper as her boyfriend. Vasper's forced smile, and the sorrow in his eyes, were unmistakable. Meanwhile, Jake and Jacob exchanged sarcastic grins. Justin cleared his throat, and David subtly kicked his foot under the table. They act as if they heard nothing. "Oh, I've seen him before, Shanti. Isn't he Princess Samara's boyfriend? My God. He's the one I saw on TV." Jasmine exclaimed, her eyes widening with excitement. "Nice to meet you, sir." "Your Highness?" Jasmine asked, her eyes questioning Shanti for confirmation. Shanti laughed, though it felt like a dagger to her heart as she listened to Jasmine mention Samara's name. "Sir." "That's fine," Shanti whispered to Jasmine. "Ah, okay. Sorry," Jasmine said, noticing that Vasper hadn't responded. He simply stared off into the distance, while David and the guardians exchanged knowing glances. Shanti suddenly stood up, grabbing Jasmine by the arm. "Let's go downstairs to talk," she said, leading Jasmine away. They sat on a bench beneath the veranda, but the men could still hear their conversation due to their enhanced hearing abilities. "All your companions are so handsome. Are you at the point now where you only accept handsome people around you?" Jasmine joked, though there was a hint of truth in her words. "What? You think they're all handsome?" Shanti teased back, smiling. Jasmine grinned widely. "Yes. Where did they come from?" "They don't seem to be from around here," Jasmine said, her curiosity piqued. Shanti just nodded. "But the most handsome of them all is Vasper, Princess Samara's boyfriend," Jasmine added, causing another pang in Shanti's chest. Shanti smiled weakly at Jasmine's comment. They're a perfect match, aren't they? I mean, she's a princess, so he should look royal too. Actually, he's even more handsome than Prince Raphael, Jasmine said, playfully nudging Shanti. And you're with Prince Raphael, right? Jasmine asked mischievously, her smile and gaze teasing Shanti. I saw the way you two looked at each other in the newspapers. You both looked so in love, Jasmine added, causing Shanti's mouth to drop open as she stared at her friend, unsure of how to explain everything. Suddenly, they heard the loud laughter of Justin, Gabriel, and Louis from the veranda, even though they were far away. Jasmine, that wasn't real. Don't believe what you saw in the newspapers. It was just for publicity, Shanti explained, watching Jasmine's reaction closely. Not real? What about this? Jasmine asked, taking Shanti's hand and examining the ring again. My God. You know, I could build 2 mansions with this or even more, Shanti. Aren't you afraid to wear it? But then again, you've got plenty of bodyguards, guardians, around you, Jasmine joked. Shanti laughed at Jasmine's straightforwardness, knowing that whatever was on her mind, she would say out loud. Yet, Jasmine's beauty was undeniable. So you're not dating Prince Raphael? Jasmine asked again. Just to make sure. No, Shanti replied firmly. Then, who is your boyfriend? Why haven't you introduced him to me? Surely, you're proud of him, right? I mean, he should be proud of you. Just look at your beauty, it's unmatched anywhere. Rare beauty. Exquisite. Jasmine exclaimed, her eyes and hand gestures full of admiration. As my mother used to say every time I called her, asking about you, oh, my dear, Shanti is getting more beautiful every day. That's why her father keeps her hidden away at home, never letting her go out, Jasmine said, mimicking her mother's voice, making them both laugh. And I would say, so when I come back, Shanti will surely be a goddess, Jasmine continued, laughing along with Shanti at the memory. As Shanti and Jasmine laughed together, Justin joined in, adding to their amusement. Jasmine then teased Shanti, imagine, you're only 18 and already engaged? Your boyfriend is really making sure no one else can have you, huh? It's like picking a fruit before it's fully ripe. Shanti smiled at Jasmine's playful teasing. Jasmine continued, when are you going to introduce him to me, Shanti? I'm excited to meet him and see if he's more handsome than the guys around here. Shanti laughed softly, I'll introduce you when the time is right. Just then, Shanti noticed Vasper standing on the veranda, looking their way. She quickly shifted her seat to face away from him, not wanting to meet his gaze. She tried to change the subject, saying, can we not talk about this anymore? It makes me uncomfortable, Shanti whispered to Jasmine. Especially with Vasper watching them. Jasmine grinned mischievously, his face is distracting, isn't it? He's probably had many girlfriends before he met Samara. Shanti chuckled awkwardly, finding it hard to keep up with Jasmine's bluntness and truthfulness. Guys like him are a red flag for me, Jasmine admitted. I wouldn't even try with someone that handsome, there would be too much competition in bed. They both laughed, but Shanti lightly slapped Jasmine on the shoulder, saying, Jasmine, enough with the crazy talk. The laughter from the veranda grew louder, catching their attention. Jasmine whispered, see? He left. They couldn't have heard us, right? It's just us here. I think he knew we were talking about him and went back to his table. Shanti couldn't resist glancing back, and sure enough, Vasper was no longer there. It's just us girls, right? Girl talk, Jasmine said with a wink. You're not the only one I talk to like this, my friends and I are even crazier. It's what keeps us close. Do you have any friends now that your father is gone? You're free to make some, you know. Jasmine's voice turned serious, and her eyes softened. Your life is so different from mine, Shanti. It's like you're in a golden cage. Shanti felt a lump in her throat. If only Jasmine knew the truth about her life. Instead of replying, Shanti changed the subject. So, how's your love life, Jasmine? She wanted the focus off herself and onto Jasmine. Jasmine sighed, Well, my first relationship didn't end well. We were supposed to get married, but a month before the wedding, he was deployed to Afghanistan and never made it alive. Shanta's heart sank, regretting her question. Jasmine, I'm so sorry, she said, squeezing Jasmine's hands. It's okay, Shanti, Jasmine reassured her. That was 3 years ago. I've moved on now, though it took over a year. I was a mess, but now I can talk about it without breaking down. Don't worry, I'm still single, haven't found anyone like him, and haven't fallen in love again. She smiled, adding, I was 19 then, and now I'm 22. I would have been married young if things had gone as planned. Jasmine then leaned closer, lowering her voice. You know, he was the one who took my virginity before he left for Afghanistan. Shanti was shocked by the personal revelation. Since he was leaving, I gave it to him as a gift, Jasmine continued, making a gesture with her hand and shoulder. I couldn't walk properly for 3 days. Imagine that, Shanti. Shanti was puzzled, not understanding why Jasmine couldn't walk properly. Meanwhile, the laughter from the veranda grew louder, with Vasper's voice joining in. Shanti and Jasmine ignored it, thinking their conversation was too quiet to be overheard. Shanti asked innocently, why couldn't you walk properly? Jasmine looked at her with wide eyes, realizing Shanti was still innocent. Wow. You're still a virgin, aren't you? She teased. Shanti blushed, embarrassed by Jasmine's straightforwardness. You've never experienced it, right? It's not easy to lose your virginity. It feels like a knife is being thrust into you, especially if it's big and long. You might not walk straight for a week, Jasmine warned, half-jokingly. Shanta's heart raced, feeling as if cold water had been poured over her. A knife, she laughed nervously. The picture of Vasper's long and big thing was on her mind, while the laughter on the veranda continued even louder. Yeah, my fiancé was 5 feet 7 inches, with a medium build, but he was tall and big. I couldn't walk straight for 3 days. If the guy's even taller? Forget it, you might not get out of bed for a day, Jasmine said with a laugh, as Shanti playfully slapped her on the shoulder, joining in the laughter. Hey! Stop it! Shanti said, laughing as well. She can't handle Jasmine's humor. Jasmine, can you please stop? It's as if you're telling a horror story. Imagine a knife. Shanti said, laughing. Jasmine, too, joined in the laughter at her own tale. A horror story? They heard a louder laughter from the veranda. Jasmine chuckled. You're really still so innocent. Why, are you scared? Don't be afraid, it's wonderful, especially if you really love him. Besides, it depends on who's leading. If he's very skilled, even if it's your first time, it might hurt, yes, but you'll still find it pleasurable. As long as he knows how to drive, Jasmine added, her voice laden with emotion. Shanti, on the other hand, began to feel even more nervous, her thoughts wandering to Vasper. Knowing how tall and broad Vasper was. And she'd already seen it, and it fits to Jasmine's description. Her body seemed to tremble at the thought. Jasmine looked at her and laughed. Your boyfriend is lucky, Jasmine said, smiling knowingly. But yeah, it hurts, really hurt. Laughing, teasing her. Cross my heart, it's true. Like, take Vasper, for example, he's the tallest among them, right? He's got a great build, and he's incredibly handsome too. He'd be amazing in bed. Samara must be having the time of her life with him. She'd probably not be able to walk straight for a week, Jasmine joked, laughing softly. Shanta's heart skipped a beat, feeling a pang of pain as Jasmine mentioned Samara's name. Her smile faltered, something Jasmine noticed. Sorry if I scared you with my stories, Jasmine said, trying to comfort her. Don't worry, it only hurts the first time. After that, it's all pleasure. The laughter from the veranda continued, making Shanti wonder if the guys were actually listening in on their conversation. But it was hard to believe, given how quietly they had been speaking and how far away they were. As long as you love him, it'll make you happy, Jasmine concluded. At that moment, David stood up, looking over at Shanti. Your companion is getting up, Jasmine noted, looking at David. Shanti glanced at him, and he signaled that it was time to leave. Shanti stood up and took Jasmine's hands. "We're leaving now. Let's meet again before you go," Shanti said with a smile. "Promise you'll meet me before I leave? How about you visit my house before I leave on the 27th? There's a farewell party on the 26th, and I'd love it if you could come," Jasmine invited. "I'll do my best to attend your farewell party," Shanti promised. "And thank you. Even though it was brief, I enjoyed your company," Shanti said quietly but sincerely, and Jasmine felt the truth in her words. Jasmine smiled warmly at Shanti, knowing how few friends Shanti had around her, unaccustomed to being surrounded by many people. Jasmine was also glad that they had a chance to talk, even if only for a short while. They hugged once more before parting ways. As the men headed to their cars in the garage, Jasmine whispered to Shanti, "Wow. What's it like to be surrounded by such handsome men?" Shanti laughed, and Jasmine continued, "He's kind of aloof, isn't he?" She nodded towards Jake, who had overheard but didn't react. "Is he your type?" Shanti teased. "Maybe," Jasmine admitted with a shy smile. "But he's aloof, and I'm not his type," she added, looking down. Shanti laughed, realizing Jasmine had a crush on Jake. The men had already gotten into their cars, but Shanti lingered outside, reluctant to leave Jasmine. "All right, see you on the 26th, promise," Shanti said before Jasmine walked towards the other building. Shanti watched, deciding which car to get into as they all looked the same. But then Vasper stepped out of a car, standing outside to signal to Shanti that he was there. However, with so many people watching them, Shanti decided to get into the nearest car. She opened the door and got into the front seat, only to realize Jake was the one driving. It was just the two of them in the car. Jake looked at her seriously. Shanti instinctively reached for the door to step out, intending to join David, but Jake suddenly stopped her and fastened her seatbelt. Shanti remained still as Jake buckled her in, not moving. But then Jake looked at her, face to face. "Why, Shanti? Are you afraid to ride with me?" Jake whispered, his voice just loud enough for her to hear. "No, Jake. It's just that I thought this was David's car. I didn't check the plate number," Shanti explained, pushing Jake's chest lightly to get him back to his seat. She fell silent, sitting quietly in her seat, as Jake drove the car with a stern expression. Shanti felt uneasy with Jake's demeanor. As they left the vineyard, Jake sped up, making sure they couldn't be caught by the other cars. Shanti's heart raced as she watched Jake, who was dead serious. Jake kept glancing in the mirror, watching the car behind them. Shanti strained to hear if Vasper was in the other car, but she heard nothing. Suddenly, Vasper appeared in the rearview mirror, his expression stern and angry. Shanti turned to look at him, their eyes locking. He looked serious and upset. Was Vasper angry with her for choosing to ride with Jake instead of him? She hadn't known it was Jake's car, and with so many people around, she had just tried to avoid getting too close to Vasper. She said nothing, and Jake's face grew even more frustrated, knowing Vasper was behind them. Shanti closed her eyes, wondering how long she would continue to be afraid when these two were around. Jake glanced at Shanti, but she didn't look back, knowing Vasper was watching from behind. Silence filled the car. When they reached a stoplight, it was still eerily quiet. Shanti closed her eyes, pretending to sleep. She leaned her head against the seat, but it kept sliding off to the side. Jake noticed and grabbed a car pillow, lifting her head gently to place the pillow under it. Shanti was startled, waking up suddenly, and their eyes met. "I can do it, Jake," she said, pushing Jake away and adjusting the pillow herself. She avoided looking at Vasper, not wanting to see his reaction, knowing she probably wouldn't like it. She closed her eyes again, turning her body away from Jake, and tried to sleep. They still had a long way to go. When they stopped at another light, she woke up again, her neck sore from the awkward position. She twisted her neck to relieve the tension when Vasper nudged her. "Come here," Vasper said sternly. She hesitated. "Shanti, here," Vasper repeated, his voice more commanding. Jake scowled, glaring at Vasper. Shanti unbuckled her seatbelt and moved over to sit next to Vasper. Vasper pulled her closer, seating her right beside him. Shanta looked at him, wanting to remind him that their agreement, no physical touch, still held. "We'll go ahead so you can rest properly in your room," Vasper said, his voice directed at David, but clearly intended for everyone to hear. And suddenly, Shanti and Vasper were no longer in Jake's car. In frustration, Jake slammed his hands on the steering wheel, furious at Vasper. He sped up the car in his anger, with David shaking his head at Jake's temperamental outburst.